Welcome back, everybody. Now we're going to get into session 16 of our 5-day conference with the International Emergency Management Society. And we're going to talk about environment, trauma, and international crisis aspects and different topics. And first of all, we will have Kelly, who's with us today to discuss bigger ships, more containers, and emergency and environmental disaster, which is extremely interesting, I think. I'm really looking forward to this because of the supply chain issues coming out of the United States out of recent weeks. So it'll be quite an interesting presentation. So Kelly, over to you. I'm looking forward to your presentation. I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Thanks a lot. Good morning, good afternoon. Good, so I'm going to talk about something that's come up from my perspective as somebody involved in disaster management and disaster risk reduction, working outside the United States. I'm based in the United States right now, but I generally work internationally on different aspects of disaster risk management. So floods, fires, earthquakes, whatever have you, conflict, other kinds of things. But what I've been working on a lot in the last decade or so are issues related to the environment. And so one of the things that has come up in looking at the environment is we're realizing that we're having a lot of environmental impacts from disaster response and from disasters. And so there's some effort now to look at a broader aspect of disaster response, disaster management, to include the environment and not just say, well, you know, it's a disaster, and once we deal with the disaster, we can plant trees later, as somebody once said to me. As I said, this is an emerging, what we call an environmental hazard. It's a multiple facet hazard that has really become apparent in the last decade or so. But we really haven't seen a lot of attention given to it from either the emergency management side or especially the environmental side, because this is posing a little bit more of a problem than just simply a ship catching fire. So we had the event with the Express Pearl in Sri Lanka earlier this year. I'm sure you're all aware of the event. And what it highlighted was actually new things that can go wrong with the ship. The container ship itself was relatively small. It had, I think, 1,800 or so containers on it. It was a ship designed to actually shuttle quickly between smaller ports to both distribute containers offloaded from a larger ship or to pick up containers from smaller ports and move them around. And it was working principally in the Indian Ocean area. What it had on board were some containers that had nitric acid that was leaking, and they recognized this, that there was a problem with the containers during the transit of the ship between ports. And what they did was they went into a couple of ports and they said, "Can we offload the containers?" And the port said, "No, we're not going to take them. We can't handle them," basically. And although the containers themselves are relatively small, it is a problem for a port where you have a container that might explode or catch fire, and then it causes a lot of issues and water pollution if you try to put it out. Catch other containers on fire, it could shut down your port for a period of time. So for all these reasons, the port is not very willing to take a problematic container off a ship. But then that leaves a problem. And so what they ended up doing was having to leave the containers on the ship, and they were trying to negotiate offloading the containers. I think in Colombo was where they were headed. But unfortunately, the containers eventually caught fire, and then they set other containers on fire, and then the ship caught fire. And the ship eventually sank. But it wasn't a quick process. So you had a bunch of containers catching fire, then more and more containers catching fire, and then eventually the ship compromising its ability to float, basically, and then sinking. And the irony, of course, was as they were trying to haul it out to a deeper sea location, it sank in relatively shallow water. So the superstructure is still above water. Now, what was one of the most obvious points raised in the media was that there was a lot of stuff in the containers, and the containers themselves came off the ship and released a lot of pollution. Now, some of it was these very small pieces of plastic that are used to manufacture plastic things. There were containers full of that. And you see a picture of people in Sri Lanka trying to collect these small pieces of plastic off the beach. And of course, they were dangerous for humans. They're dangerous for fish because they can be ingested and cause the fish to die. But there are also other chemicals involved, and a whole range of chemicals on the ship, and also putting out the fire resulted in marine pollution. The overall environmental impact, the long-term environmental impact is not known, but it's going to be an issue, partly because the ship is still giving off chemicals, still giving off pollution in the ocean. And they're going to have to go in and remove the ship because it is a hazard for navigation. So this wasn't the first time a container ship had caught fire, but it was actually a very dramatic representation of the issues that could be faced. And some of which we know how to deal with, but maybe not as well as we could, and some of which seem to be relatively new in the process of dealing with. Yes, sorry, there's a picture of the ship on fire. And of course, the most common way of dealing with a ship on fire is to pour water on it. And if you have a ship in the ocean and the containers that have burst open and break that are on fire, there's a lot of contamination that obviously goes into the ocean. And that's an immediate challenge with how to deal with this. And I'll give you an example later of how authorities in Canada dealt with a similar problem, but used a slightly different technique. So we have a couple of things that we might consider new. So it's a growing size of container ships. We're up to ships that can carry about 20,000 container equivalent units. That's not a single container. Some of these are slightly larger, but that's how we characterize them. So there may be less than 20,000 on a ship, but it can carry up to 20,000 standard 20-foot containers. The fire hazard management on a ship, of course, is something that's been very well developed over the years, but has not, according to the insurance industry particularly, not really evolved for these container ships. So you have the option of below deck using nitrogen, for instance, flooding an area with nitrogen to try to put out fires. That doesn't work above deck, of course, and it presumes that below deck you have access to all the areas where the containers are, and they can be quite tightly packed. Above deck, the typical thing to use is water, but a lot of the chemicals you'll find on a ship in the containers shouldn't come in contact with water for a variety of reasons. And so that poses a problem. The other thing is that on a ship, a modern ship, particularly a container ship, the staffing has been reduced to the minimum level. And so you may not have a team of 50 people on board who can start doing all the things necessary to try to put out a fire, even if they can reach the area of the fire. So if the fire is below deck, it would be almost impossible to reach. If the fire is above deck, it may be someplace in a stack of containers that are 20 containers high and 4 or 5 containers across. And it may be a container in there someplace. And most ships would not have the means to actually move containers around to find the ones that might be on fire or might be leaking or something like that. So the ability on a ship to put out a fire these container ships is actually quite limited compared to other types of ships. Another issue that's come up, and again, this may not really be considered new, but it's becoming newly significant, is either incompetence or efforts to reduce cost by mislabeling what's in the container. And this seems to have been one of the factors that might have contributed to the problem with the Express Pearl. It may not have been clear that they actually had nitric acid in the containers. When the containers are loaded, they should be loaded in such a way that both dangerous containers are not next to each other, but also dangerous containers are in known locations on the ship. So if something happens, they know what to do about it and they know where the danger is. And if a container is mislabeled, then it could end up next to another container. And if one catches fire, the other causes a much more serious problem. And that may have been some of the problem with the Express Pearl. Obviously, there's no reason for a port to take a sinking ship in its port, because if it does, it can close down the port. And there's also no reason for it to off-take a container that may be leaking or may pose other kinds of problems. Now, this has happened, and this kind of situation has happened in other countries. Djibouti was one case where they had a number of containers that had been offloaded with hazardous materials, and nobody came and picked them up. They were sort of abandoned in the port. And then the port has to end up dealing with that problem, which can be quite complex and difficult. And so ports are not inclined under the current situation to take dangerous cargo that they can't get rid of by sending it out of the port. And so this provides very limited opportunities or options for a ship which has hazardous cargo that has posed a problem. It's leaking or it's caught fire or it's heating up in terms of what to do with it. And they can't, in most cases, actually dump the cargo in the ocean if that were necessary, because they can't get to the cargo, they can't maneuver the containers on the ship. And then one of the interesting things that came out of the X-Pro response and has come up with a couple of other ship events, ship sinking events or ship problem events in the recent past is we have a relatively well international system for dealing with oil spills, but we don't have the same system dealing with other kinds of marine pollution. So when the Express Pearl caught fire and started having cargo drop overboard and containers break open and start to cause marine pollution, the oil spill people wouldn't necessarily immediately respond to that. So the ship owner and the other organizations involved would have to find people to come in and do it. Now, there are people who can deal with this, but an oil spill is quite different than a lot of floating little plastic pieces. And so that's a capacity that we really haven't developed. And it's a bit ironic is that if there was an oil spill, if it was a tanker, there would be quite a well-established system for responding. But the kind of problem we saw at the Express Pearl, it had to be sort of put together as time evolved. And it put a pressure on a single country, Sri Lanka, which was able to get resources from India and neighboring countries. But it was a totally new problem for them in a sense. By the way, Sri Lanka had been dealing with a tanker that had caught fire on the other side of the island sometime earlier in 2021. So it's not as if they were ignorant of the challenges faced in dealing with things on the open sea. This was just different. So what do you do with a burning ship? Well, the tradition is to just take it out in the ocean and hope it'll sink. And that comes back to an idea that you don't want a sunken ship in your port. You don't want it near a populated area where it might explode or cause other problems. So towing it out to sea and just hoping it will sink or sinking it has historically been the safest thing to do. But what we've increasingly seen is when these ships sink, they continue to be a source of pollution. And in the case of the Express Pearl, if you don't get it deep enough to sink, it becomes a hazard of navigation and continued source of nearshore pollution. So the other thing that another case that just happened recently in Canada was with the Zim Kingston off of British Columbia. It was a container ship, not a large one really, that lost a bunch of containers in a storm in the North Pacific, something that happens quite frequently apparently. But in that process, it damaged some of the containers that stayed on board, and those containers caught fire. Now, the material that was burning would be aggravated if it came in contact with water. So they basically let that row of containers burn out on the ship, anchored offshore off of Victoria, British Columbia, in the hope that the fire would burn out, and they just cooled the ship with water. They didn't put water directly on the fire. Now, it was a risk because if the container stacks, if other containers started catching fire, they would have had a bigger fire, a ship with a bigger fire, and their options would have been limited because of the problem of using water. So they were in a sense lucky, but also there was probably a lot of planning they went in looking at the different containers that were in either side of the burning area and what they could do about it. So they were quite successful there. The ship did not sink. They didn't lose the other containers on the ship. So it was kind of the opposite of what happened with the Express Pearl. It was a good outcome rather than a highly negative outcome. But these are the kinds of problems we think we'll be seeing more of, which is a ship losing containers and then having a second problem. So what's next? Where can we go on this? And I would note that the insurance industry, maritime insurance industry, has been very interested in this problem, particularly because of the option of losing a container ship with 20,000 containers. So the first point is improving the accuracy of the container documentation. Ship operators don't know what's in the containers. They don't know where to put them safely on the ship. They don't know how to keep dangerous cargo separate from each other. And they don't know how to put them in places where if something goes wrong, they can access them and they can take action to reduce a problem. The container ship firefighting capacities need to be rethought. The idea of using nitrogen below or inert gases below deck might be still a good idea, but above deck, it's not going to work. And your only options there are either using water, which may not be recommended, which may be not a good thing, or to let the fire burn out on the ship. Now, with the case of the Zim Kingston, they were successful in that, but the Express Pearl was the opposite of what happens when you try to let something burn out. This whole issue of what you do with a burning ship, it really needs to be rethought. The old process, centuries-old process of hauling the ship out and letting it sink or burn out in the open ocean just really doesn't match what we think about both the use of the ocean. I mean, what is the ocean as a natural resource, but also how we manage hazards in the ocean, and particularly concerned about marine pollution and sources of marine pollution, as in the case of the Express Pearl, that will probably go on for years until they remove the ship. And then there need to be these operational capacities, like with oil spills, to respond to these kinds of problems. So when you have ships with multiple different cargoes on board in the containers, there needs to be a capacity to come in and try to resolve those the resulting environmental pollution that comes from the ship sinking or catching fire, rather than just hoping that they can clean it up once it gets ashore and doing it in an ad hoc manner. So there needs to be something very similar to the oil spill response capacity developed for this. Not necessarily as large or as elaborate, but something that ensures countries like Sri Lanka and all the maritime states in the world can access rapidly the proper resources with proper training and proper planning to respond to these kinds of problems. So just in conclusion, sorry for the problems of starting the presentation, but I would just like to conclude that the fire on container ships is an emerging challenge for the environment and also for safe ship operation. The issue is getting attention, but it's really not reached the level of understanding how to start dealing with the problems of a burning container ship with 20,000 units on board. If you can imagine the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal catching fire in the Suez Canal, your options would have been very limited for what would have turned out to be a much worse disaster. The whole idea of how to deal with fires on a container ship need to be rethought, and the whole approach to dealing with ocean pollution as a result of fires on container ships needs to be rethought. We've done this with oil spills. We need to now come to this new type of ship, or this larger type of ship that we're now seeing, and look at it from a different perspective and a different way of managing with these issues. The option of offloading dangerous cargo needs to be rethought, and particularly the abilities of ports and the liability questions and other kinds of things all need to be rethought. So we're moving into the 21st century, a couple of decades in, and we really need to move forward on our thinking and capacities to deal with what will probably be an emerging new type of disaster from container ships catching fire as we go through the rest of the century. I hope we can deal with this and reduce the risk to the level that's quite acceptable. Thank you very much. This has been a presentation on bigger ships, more containers, and emergency environmental hazard. You have my email address there, havedisaster@kelly@gmail.com. Feel free to contact me if you want more information, and if there are any questions, we can deal with that in the chat or directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, a very interesting presentation in light of sort of, the growing industry, which I think is just scaled substantially over the last decade or so. We have a couple minutes left, and there is one question for you, which is there a case to be made for restructuring the mandate of civil defense or military forces to have standby capacity to deal with ship plastic container fires as a national security challenge?
Yes. What we saw in the case of the Express Pearl was governments in both India and Sri Lanka doing their best in dealing with a problem that they had not dealt with before. Now, as I said, Sri Lanka had been dealing with actually an oil tanker catchment that was on fire to the east of the country. So it's not as if they didn't know anything about dealing with ships in trouble. But there weren't disaster plans. There weren't, and particularly short-side disaster plans. So there weren't plans on how do you deal with a container ship that's dumping lots of pollution and coming ashore. And it was all done, much of it was done on an ad hoc basis. They're experts, of course, who can provide advice, but who's going to pay? How do you do those things? So I think there's a need to start in national disaster planning and even the coastal disaster planning, start anticipating these kinds of events and incorporating them into the planning, both from international, actually, down to local level planning. I think that would be a very valuable thing to rethink this process.
Thanks. And just one more quick question from my side, I think, which is, you've mentioned the industry, right? And so you mentioned sort of the shipping industry, insurance industry, and things like that. How receptive are they to, say, increased fire protection standards, increased safety requirements? I mean, I ask that because I had come from a fire protection background, and there's always a bit of resistance, right? So a bit of resistance because it can be expensive. How is sort of the shipping industry, the commercial shipping industry, responding to these growing requirements and growing hazards?
Well, what I know from what I've been able to find out is that the marine insurance people are really on top of this issue. They've issued a number of reports, annual reports, where they've highlighted this problem, and they've raised the issues about firefighting capacities and systems and things like that. So I'm not sure that it's not so much a case, as far as I understand, that the shipping industry is opposed to making their ships safer and things like that, because there are the SOAS, the standards for safety at sea and everything, which are evolving. But what we're looking at here is a multifaceted challenge that no one party sort of has oversight for, except maybe for the International Maritime Organization. But if we go back 20 or 30 years and look at what the response, when there were oil spills and all the concern that evolved out of that, there was a whole system that developed on how to deal with that. And that's where we're at right now, I think. The technology on dealing with fires below deck and above deck needs to be reviewed. The cost of dealing with a ship that's in trouble needs to be looked at, because the insurance companies pay for that. And then in addition, the knowledge and planning and capacity in a country on how to deal with this kind of problem, any coastal country has to be able to deal with this. And that's not something that's evolved. That's not where there's resistance. It's just something that people haven't looked at so far. And if we contrast the way that the ship in British Columbia was dealt with the Express Pearl, in a sense, in British Columbia, they were just lucky that only one stack of containers caught fire. Otherwise, they would have had the same situation as the Express Pearl. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. Harold?
Great presentation, Kelly. And coming from Norway, we have a big shipping industry. It's not registered in Norway, all of them anymore, but some of them have these big containers. And also the Norske Veritas, where I worked for 15 years, which now is also merged with Germanische Lloyds. Maybe we should send I will send I have still contacts there, send your presentation and ask. This is also something they should look upon in classification, because they had to rethink, as you say, how they deal with fires. And well, from my experience with the shipping industry, I've worked there for 15 years, they should be leading actually from Norway. They have a very good environment in dealing with this. So I will send it over, and you should also maybe approach them yourself. This belongs to the classification societies and also the shipping industry themselves.
I would say, very good point, Harold, and thank you very much for that suggestion. I would say that parts of the shipping industry are very aware of this. As I said, the maritime insurance people and the SOAS, the safety elite at sea. But when you go out to a country like Sri Lanka and having a local disaster plan outside of Colombo for dealing with a ship that catches fire and pollutes the beaches, that level is just not there. And then the international response mechanism, part of the challenge is that in the case of Sri Lanka was the owner of the ship had to pay for people to come and do the work, whereas the oil spill response is already paid for. And so there are a lot of pieces that need to be pulled together here. So Harold, your suggestion is really good, and I think I'll follow up. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I will follow up from my side, but you are the expert, so please also follow up yourself.
Very much appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Now, so the next presentation is to Johnston Wong. So we're going to discuss trauma-informed responses to emergencies in the digital era. And Johnston, over to you. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Kai. And then thank you, Charles, for a very interesting presentation as well. I think it's not just one ship or two ships. It's a whole industry that we should look into. And then and I would like to share my screen now, and hopefully it will go all right. All right. Thank you very much. Yep. I also want to thank Harold and TIEMS to allow me to present this topic at this very important conference. and then it is a 5-day conference, very extensive. Well, and then I have also asked some of my students. I'm teaching a disaster management course for One Belt One Road countries, and then I have more 10, 15 students, and I encourage them also to attend this conference, which is free for them. It's not easy for them. Okay, so my topic at this time, this presentation is digital emergency response and trauma-informed practices. What I'm trying to point out is that digital emergency response is getting more and more common, and then it poses a challenge to how we can prepare our responders. And very often they are just volunteers. They are not even full-time responders, but they can all go to the internet and try to help when there is a serious disaster. So I'm using this case of that happened recently in July, and then 2021, and it happens in the Zhou, and then in the province of Henan, and then it created a flood. Okay, so what happened on those few days is actually, for example, the rainfall in 2 days is the all rainfall level of the normal year. So Zhou has the whole year's rainfall fell onto it just in 2 days. So it is quite unprepared, because we may say it never happened in 100 years, but now with the climate changes, that we know that it's something like that will happen. And then after those 2 or 3 days, actually the rainfall continues, and then for almost 2 or 3 weeks. But fortunately not in Zhou, but in other parts of the Henan, and it moved a little bit northward and westward, something like that. Okay, but in the flood, in this 3 or 4 days, we understand that, and it was reported that over 6,000 volunteers, they rushed to the internet and tried to help as information volunteers. And they most of them spent 5 to 6 hours average. And some of them actually spent 2 or 3 days continuously on the WeChat groups. So there's over 100 WeChat groups that try to help and intervene, and they become the responders. And there's one document called I Seek Help document. It received 2.5 million requests and replies. And then it was updated in just a few days 400 times. So it provides information on who is seeking help, who is around, who are the rescuers around, and whether they can match each other in life saving, as well as other food and supply kind of thing, or etc. So later on in October, Shanxi province has another flood. And then the same phenomenon occurred, that 400 volunteers put into 8,000 hours and try to do something on the internet. So I'm saying digital emergency responses is now getting more and more popular when the use of iPhone was widespread. Okay, so what about Zhou? I just want to briefly give you an idea. Actually, it is a very modern city now. It is in the center, also in the center of China. So you can see the view of Zhou, and then it is in the center. You can see that I circled it. It is almost in the center of China. And of course, Wuhan is also in the center of China. So Zhou was the capital of Hunan provinces, and there were over 10 million population. And on those few days, unfortunately, it was reported around 200 more deaths, and 47 missing. Probably those also cannot be redeemed and found. So the government, of course, announced that it is a level 1 emergency response. And then unfortunately, one of the sad story is that in the Zhou metro, it was stopped, but because there was so much rain, and then actually the metro was also flooded, and then 12 persons died and 5 injured just in the line of metro. So people are worried very much about if metro underground is facing with a flood. So perhaps it is also a classical case to study and how we can prevent our metros from being affected by a serious flood. So, but that is not my topic here. Today I would talk more about the influences on our volunteers. Okay, so and indeed a lot of people were affected, and then more than around 300,000 residents were relocated, and then affected, and then people were relocated, and then a lot of crops were affected. Okay, just give you some example that some of the pictures that we can see from the press. So it is how serious it is. Actually very serious. It's like any other major disaster. And then transportations was blocked, and then electricity went out, and then of course even the Wi-Fi is not working at some places. So when electricity went out, hospitals were flooded, and then some doctors has to carry out surgery with temporary power. Okay, so and people, if the electricity were out, you can imagine that in those high rises where we pumped the water, the fresh water to the rooftop, and then let it pour down. So if there's no electricity, that means these high rises will not have water. So actually the government has to distribute water, fresh water on the streets by using water cars, etc. And then the traffic was not resumed only after 3 days, because a lot of tunnels were also flooded. Okay, that is the metro under heavy rain, and then it is fortunate that actually the government has tried very hard, and then a lot of volunteers, rescuers also try very hard to save the people. And actually most people, most passengers on the metro were saved. Okay, and then go back to this issue. I'm talking about that a lot of volunteers will try to help in the on the internet. So you can see a lot of different documents. So that is one of the documents that they try to produce. Then because it was actually dig out, like data mining, they dig out from the WeChat, just like the chat room of the Google or Facebook. They dig it out from the Facebook and put it on the file, like this Excel kind of file, and then it's a kind of apps, and then we can collect all information, and then give the location of the information, etc., etc. 1 or 2 organizations, NGOs, is very experienced in doing this kind of help. So they would, after they find it out, take it out from through data mining on the Facebook kind of WeChat, and then they would try to confirm it. They would confirm it, and then they would get the location of the people who request for help, and then they will announce this information on the web, and then they will also connect the rescuers. So the NGO and then numerous volunteers just joined into a huge force, and then they provide digital emergency response. So what do? They connect people trapped with rescue teams. They connect people who are starving, who may not have food, with restaurant or food stop donors. They do not know each other. They join each other. They may know 1 or 2 friends in the group, and then they were dragged into these volunteer groups, and then they will identify themselves normally by a team name. So they call themselves A team or B team. So and to create that identity, and also it enable them to have a sense of comradeship. And one team has recorded over 100,000 requests in the 2 days. And then the rescue teams were mostly volunteers. And although the government has sent out almost 2,000 firefighters to help, but if you remember that I talked about that it is a city of around 10 million people. So it's a big city. And then and actually more than 1,000 volunteer rescue team rushed to the site in 1 or 2 days from neighboring cities. So it is, again, of course, it's a government responsibility, but also is a community mutual help. But what about the volunteers? My concern here is when we are going into the age of digital emergency response, and more work we can do by using the internet power. And at the same time, we do not have time to prepare our volunteers, and then we cannot arrange prior training to them. Whether there is a way that we can improve our psychological support to these volunteers and also training to these volunteers, that is what the point that I'm trying to make. And then I hope that in the future, we can also develop a lot of assistance, digital assistance to these volunteers. Okay, so we did, Candy and I, and then the social workers cross borders, we try to collect some information, and then we sent out a survey to 191 volunteers who are helping with this information and information emergency work. So we found out that among them, 50 persons are considered normal. They scored in CSD 10 less than 9 points. So they actually do not have a significant symptoms of stress. But there are 69 with mild depression, and then 23 with severe depression. Okay, how would it compare with the normal population? And we refer to other studies. So one study showing that the general population, there's only a depression rate of 13.24%, but it was conducted in year 2011, a bit old. And then another survey, but which is conducted by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which is a very reputable social sciences institution in China. And then they do a PSUS, that means it is an annual kind of information collection, that survey among young people. And then their statistic shows that the depression rate was 36.3% among college students, much higher than the general population. But after all, we have in this sample 48%. So we can say that among the volunteers, the depression rate is very high. Okay, so why is this so? Because I think, first of all, people may develop secondary traumatic stress. And STS was included in DSM in 2013. Okay, DSM-4 already is considered as one kind of mental disorder. And then after that, actually, the whole counseling services consider it very important to adopt what we call trauma-informed perspective. That means when we are doing emergency work or we are doing other kind of counseling work, we should bear in mind that there will be a secondary trauma for mental health social workers, and the counselors. So the normal kind of secondary trauma, one is called compassion fatigue. That means after working for some time, when we were exhausted, we would not be able to maintain an empathetic and sympathetic or even sympathetic kind of mind. So we actually burn out. And then another kind is vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma means we may even affect our value system. Originally, we are very enthusiastic and then trying to help people, and then we become a volunteer. And because of the frustration, and then because of our, we feel that we are so helpless and hopeless, then we think that it is meaningless. It is no longer meaningful to become a volunteer. So it is kind of a self-denial. And then it is full of suspicion, pessimism and powerlessness. Then this kind of spread, if we allowed it to continue, then it is very destructive to the work of an NGO, because you would no longer be able to recruit volunteers in the future. So it is important for the NGO to try to help their volunteers to adjust to this kind of trauma, and then to prevent and then to recover from trauma. Okay, so trauma consultation, it is a kind of trauma consultation. Then the effects of trauma, symptoms. So we try to establish a therapeutic relationship, but this is all related with professionals. How about volunteers? Unfortunately, the volunteers are facing similar questions. They are facing similar challenges as any professional consultants. The reason is that when you're trying to connect people and you're trying to connect people with resources, very often at the early beginning of any crisis, that resources is limited, resources is insufficient. And then if you are trying to help to find some rescue team to rescue a group of a family in a particular area, then you got very frustrated because you cannot find the rescue team. And then more and more people ask for help, but there were less and less a sufficient supply of rescue teams. So at the end, you feel very horrible because you're afraid that the people you are helping may lost their lives in front of you, although it's not virtually, but it is on the web, which is not happening face to face, but actually you are seeing that their sounds may, the phone may die, and then they may say a very horrible thing when they are facing difficulties. All right, so it is also important for volunteers to receive supervision. So I would like to suggest that at the same time when we are doing this kind of recruitment of volunteers, we need to find some again volunteers, volunteer counselors, volunteer social workers to back them up, and then and provide supervision, at least to in a acceptable ratio. For example, 1 to 50, 1 to 100. And then at least they got someone that they can ask for help. And then in the trauma-informed supervision, we should, there are a number of principles: is safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. Choice is very important. We should encourage the volunteers that if you cannot stand it, then I think it is quite all right that you stop the volunteer work, and then you may come back after a while, and then, or you may shift from one kind of work to another kind of work. Okay, so we learned that early psychological intervention is important, and then the earlier we have this kind of psychological assistance is the better, and then it will help to reduce a lot of adverse effect of the trauma, and then we need to provide better training. And then we need to do the training in multiple sessions, and then we need to adopt multiple interventions. So as time is running out, I would report to you or share with you, actually in the after or during the Henan case. So the social workers across borders, in collaboration with other NGO, we do a number of things. Part one, we do an orientation, and then as part two, we do training. And then this is a kind of letter that we design when in recruitment of volunteers, we already let them know that it is trauma, that they may affect themselves. So in this, we also provide them some basic information about the kind of psychological trauma that may happen. And then we also provide them with a self-assessment form, like or other, but focus on the social psychological readiness, whether not only on whether they are smart in the digital, and but they are also whether they are also smart psychologically and socially. And then we provide an apps that they can talk to the apps, and then we have and then we also provide the peer support online groups. And on these online groups, we also connect them to pre-videoed kind of training, so they can go to these online courses if they want to study more about crisis intervention, about diffusing, debriefing. And then we also try to provide experienced social workers as counselor, but not to a very full extent. We have only a few or less than 20 counselors that can help at that time. Compared with 6,000 volunteers, we are not adequate at all. So, and then the part two, we say providing supervision. We also provided debriefings, and then we are afraid that some of the volunteers might develop severe stress. So we also try to provide computerized kind of psychological therapy. So you can see here we have a crisis management briefing. We use it like in the form of radio. So we broadcast. We have 4 podcasts during this time. So it come out almost one every week. Okay. So and then we have CCBT. CBT is a psychological cognitive behavioral therapy, but we also use it computerized form. So there is a computerized lessons that they can try to help themselves. And then that's why we think social psychological EDRM. I have tried to promote this in last TIEMS conference in Korea. I talked about social psychological EDRM already, and then it is something that we should do before, during, and after the impact of the disaster. It may involve education, positive mental health, encouragement or exercises, relief, comfort, and then reconstruction and empowerment. So it is not only provided during or after the impact, but it should be a whole process covering the 4 stages or 4 phases of EM. Okay, so it is something that we want to say, and then we want to try to develop. But at the moment, I think in the Holland experiences, we try to provide whatever we can, but that is not a comprehensive package that we can make available immediately after the impact. So we will try to develop all this into one package, and then try to provide digital, because we know that early intervention is important, and it must be made readily available to digital volunteers, and also in a digital way, in a digital format. Okay, so that is basically my presentation. Sorry for overrun for a few minutes. And then thank you for Kai. Kai has been my moderator many times, so we become so familiar. Thank you, Kai.
No, thank you so much. I think that's extremely interesting in terms of, it's almost sort of, and I'm just my opinion, right? Sort of the new age of volunteerism, right? And I don't see a lot of people talking about the dynamics and especially psychological effects of being a digital volunteer, even though I think you've correctly highlighted the fact that this is the case.
Yeah, and obviously we are going digital, and then probably social sciences and disaster management is going digital as well. Yeah.
Very interesting. If there's any questions or anything else like that, how can we get in touch with you?
Actually, we can look at or further engage in further studies in 2 aspects. One is social psychological assistance, and the other is about digital emergency response. We can use data mining kind of system and the big data, and we can also use GIS and then the remote sensing, those kind of technologies that will be used in future digital digital interventions. This time I find it a new thing, because in the past we just provide a lot of digital volunteers. They just provide comfort, like in Wuhan, it's just provide comfort. But actually, in the Henan case, they are providing rescue, because rescue is so important. Because if you do not have the locations of the people, and then you cannot connect them with the rescuers, then it is not working. So they are actually providing rescue, not only relief or psychological support.
We do have one question, if we can get through that one very quick. So, have there been instances of death by suicide among responders or volunteers because of depression?
not in this case at the moment, but we know that there's a delay effect of psychological stress. When the people develop PTSD, the highest suicide rate comes normally half a year or 1 year after the disaster. So it is, we have repeated studies that a lot of people will commit suicide. The suicidal rate will suddenly go up in any place that it happened a natural disaster, and it also it affects sometimes the responders, sometimes the government officials, and of course, and then the survivors, and etc. But among them, how many of them are volunteers? We do not know. Yeah, but I would assume a similar trend will happen, and then volunteers is not safe or entirely can. They are not free of trauma. Okay, they would not be free of trauma just because they are volunteers.
Very interesting. Okay, thank you very much. So now actually the next presentation is me. And I'm going to be fairly quick because we're going to be heading into lunch anyway in just a few minutes. But 2021 webinar series is the next topic that I'll be talking about. And this is something that, of course, we worked on with TIEMS through 2021, as many of you have attended these. And it goes along the line sort of with our last speaker and previous sort of speakers as well. When we start talking about community, when we start talking about digital tools and availability of these different type of mechanisms of communication, and this is something that some ideas and what I'm going to share today, just sort of the results of which this webinar series. You've probably seen this slide before. This is what we had for the webinar series, which was conducted from 2021 in February to December of 2021. And we actually have another one coming up soon, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But overall, throughout 2021, we had 23 total events scheduled. It was a little bit higher, but of course, some speakers had to cancel and some events were canceled. But we had a total of 1,757 attendees at these events, out of over 22 of them so far. And 72 nations were represented in terms of the registrations of people that had attended the events themselves. And you can see the countries that were actually presented their national models, or we had representatives of these nations in the webinar series itself. So anywhere from India and Czech Republic and China all the way through to Norway, South Africa, Kosovo, Thailand, Bulgaria, etc. One of the things that we saw here specifically in terms of trying to have a discussion about national models themselves, this was sort of the origin and the idea of what we wanted to do with this webinar series, was to really sort of share information and sort of learn from peers about how they were addressing the various different hazards and risks in their own nation, and what were the national structures and systems they were using or had developed in order to do that. And because, for example, I was coming from the United States, and there's a very sort of indoctrinated approach about how emergencies are managed in terms of FEMA and federal, state, local levels, and the role of insurance industry and things like that. We're sort of very indoctrinated in our approach. And so it's worth a lot of value to be able to look up from that, to see across the international community and to be able to understand what other nations are doing and try and learn from those experiences, share information and see what sort of structures are in place. And in that way, it was very valuable to see what different nations were doing. At the same time, it was also somewhat of a challenge to get nations to be able to share their models, share their ideas, and then to talk about it in that way. So it was a bit of a challenge. We did get good participation overall from a number of different nations and as how they showed their models, but it was something that we have to continue to work on. And I still think there's a lot of value in that, and we'll get to some of the lessons learned here in just a second. But we also had many different organizations that were represented as well that came out from the webinar series that we built continued relationships with, and that includes University of Manchester, and you heard from Duncan, Shaw, and David earlier this morning, and also, of course, the Pacific Disaster Center presented as well, the NATO Crisis Management Disaster Response Center of Excellence, and into Medical Intelligence, where we talked about sort of the COVID prediction, analytics, and modeling that was going through that. So we managed to also build out additional organizational partnerships and organizational relationships with teams through that process as well. And one of the things that we used as part of this process is obviously Zoom in terms of tools and capabilities, but what we also found was, we used an event sort of framework within LinkedIn and used an event series that it served its purpose. In terms of when we initially set it up, it was one of those things that once we started, we couldn't cancel it because there's I think now nearly 400 people that were involved in it. So we couldn't really get away from it, but it wasn't really a perfect scenario for us in terms of using that. It did help with our reach and engagement in order to be able to get people interested in the event and TIEMS itself, but not the best platform because you couldn't do a lot with it. You couldn't really change things. And it was sort of, one event that was the way it was sort of characterized in LinkedIn was one event every day for a year. And so it was not entirely the best sort of setup, but it was worth trying and testing. And it did provide us, and in the future can provide us with live streaming options as well, which is something that would be quite interesting. So, but in terms of the webinar, the last one that we have coming up is going to be on December 16th. And the logo is a bit pixelated there, but it's with the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure from India. And that's going to be on December 16th at 1700. And that's going to be an interesting webinar just in terms of understanding what CDRI is doing, the work that they're doing, and how they are sort of newly established as an international actor in that international space of building disaster resilient infrastructure across many different nations. And as indicated on the slide there, that's a multi-stakeholder global partnership of countries and governments, UN agencies, banks and private sector and different institutions. So it's a growing organization itself. But some of the things that we have learned in terms of the webinar series, at least from my perspective, and of course, Harold can feel free to contribute towards these ideas as well. But what we have learned is that, peer-to-peer knowledge sharing and experience is very valuable in terms of enhancing objectivity and understanding. So, even as what we're seeing is coming out of the conference here this week is the fact that sharing this information provides a lot of additional information, context and understanding towards the programs that we're all working on. And then we also have common issues and problems. But we have different solutions, and that's something that is very evident. Some of the discussions we've had during the webinar series have been very engaging and very interesting in terms of, especially with the work that University of Manchester was doing towards resilience and how we approach resilience and what that means for different nations and different societies. And as I mentioned, finding national representation is somewhat challenging. So networks and relationships are key, but I think that's one of the foundations that why even TIEMS exist is because to have that sort of international community and relationships in place with professionals across that emergency management spectrum, which is a very broad and wide range of professional disciplines. And we had a surprising amount of cooperation with agency and organizations in terms of building out the webinar series and representing their organizations and the work that they're doing and what that means for the community as well. And I also found that there was a few instances throughout the year where we had key engagement from new TIEMS members and audiences, and that also includes academic partnerships and university partnerships where we had, I think it was some students attending, I believe it was from Sri Lanka and also Philippines, as part of their university programs, that they were actually attending the webinars as part of their own training and education program that they were studying emergency and disaster management. But in terms of what we're looking forward into 2022, some of the things that we're looking at, and at least from my perspective, is that there's significant opportunities for knowledge sharing. I think this is not going to go away, and even just from our last presentation from Johnston, is that this is really something that this digital volunteering piece, this digital phenomenon, the growth of the online communities are only really starting to take place. It really sort of accelerated because of the rise of COVID and the pandemic. And so there's significant opportunities for knowledge sharing. And there's different opportunities for new forums, venues, and ways to connect the TIEMS members and organizations and new audiences and new members and TIEMS itself. And so that's something that obviously I think should be pursued. And there's values in national models. And so while we continue that work, understanding national models and sharing those experiences and understanding how nations do respond and mitigate disasters, there's value in having that conversation, and that should continue, and we should continue to work on those things. But we should also explore different formats. We should be having conversations about thematic topics, or interviewing people from various different disciplines to find out how, the work that they're doing and how that can influence the work that we're doing in our various different fields in disaster emergency management. And that could be a forum such as podcasts, interviews, and even expert panel discussions in sort of a thematic approach. It doesn't always have to be necessarily in a webinar format where we sort of have to sit in a format like this and then be able to listen to the speakers. That has one element, one approach, but we can do it in various different other formats as well, as seen here and as mentioned with the podcast. And so there's also a real role in terms of continued support to teams in that knowledge development and professional development piece. And so the TQC and other mechanisms that are with teams, and then also bridging out that, that academic and sort of university partnership, right? So integration of these perspectives into academic programs, I think, is going to be beneficial in the long term in terms of institutional and academic partnerships. So what I sort of vision and what I see heading into 2022 is there's an avenue, multiple avenues and ways to approach knowledge sharing throughout the teams community and emergency management and disaster response community writ large, at an international level. And so really some of the questions that we have, and obviously if you're interested in these things, you can drop some ideas in the chat, but is really how can we make this happen, and what do people find to be the most accessible and most expedient way to sort of share information? And, what does that really, what do we need, I guess, in terms of a community? And what do people want to listen to? What do people want to hear? And I think this is something that, we can follow up later on after the conference and maybe send a survey out. But what is it that people want to try and understand? And then where, even through the conference this week, there's been a great number of topics that we've had and a great number of presentations. And some of these things might be specifically interesting to very different groups throughout the international community and throughout teams. And so these are the type of questions I think we have to get around to, so that we're actually, serving up that information and connecting people through networks and professional partnerships and things like that. And so what does it mean for us to connect this international community? What does it mean in terms of supporting academic partnerships? And what does that mean in terms of professional development and community development, especially when we're in such an online space as we have these days? And so that's something to sort of think about. I welcome your suggestions in terms of what that actually means and how we can move forward with that. And that's something that I think we'll be looking at in terms of 2022 as we move forward. So if you haven't registered already, I'll just leave that as a final plug and promotion there. If you haven't registered already for the TIEMS webinar series, we will put the link that will be going out shortly for December 16th. Join us in our final webinar of the year. And we go through the discussions with CDRI, and we talk about their organization and what they're working on as they launch all their new programs going into the new year. And with that, we're leave any final comments or questions, and then we are going to be heading into the lunch break. Let's just see if there's anything there. Okay, Johnston put the email in there. Okay, so if you have any questions for Johnston and the presentation about sort of the digital volunteer space, please feel free to reach out to him. And if you have any comments or questions or ideas about how we can continue building out that online presence and sharing information and knowledge throughout the TIEMS community, please let me know as well. All right, so we're going to go to a 5-minute early lunch break. We will be back in 1 hour and 5 minutes.